The Calgary Stampede continues with visitors from all over the world taking in the greatest outdoor show on earth. There are also some provincial politicians there drumming up a little support, kissing babies and shaking hands. Now to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us from our provincial capital in Edmonton. Tyler, it appears as though Premier Daniel Smith and newly elected NDP leader Naheed Nenshi have been gaining thousands of supporters at a lot of their Stampede events.
They have, yeah. And, the events are generally pretty well attended, but what they're saying certainly is that they're seeing even more people than previous years. Nenshi, holding his first event as NDP leader, brought out, I think staff said about 4,000 people came out to his event and to hear him speak. And Danielle Smith had a pretty big turnout as well. She was welcoming some American politicians and stuff like that in town to have meetings and all that. So, it's sort of a regular part of the summer circuit for politicians, whether you're a federal politician or a provincial politician. The NDP caucus, for example, for sure has been out at some of Nenshi's events, and it's a chance for them to meet with supporters and meet people who are maybe not supporters. And also the networking is such a huge part of the Calgary Stampede. There's lobby firms and law firms and businesses that put on parties and events and things like that. So it's really just a big opportunity for everyone to schmooze if they so desire. And like I said, an integral part of that summer circuit. And what better place is there to do that than in the sun in Calgary on a lovely July week or so?
Absolutely. And this is nothing new for Naheed Nenshi. He used to be the former Calgary mayor, so he has his fair share of stampedes under his belt buckle there. Now, has Naheed Nenshi talked any further about the potential of severing ties with the federal NDP, kind of distancing themselves a little bit now that he's leader?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it hasn't come up all that much, I don't think. I think it's a conversation that's going to happen. It's unavoidable at this point, and some of the polling suggests that might actually improve the NDP fortunes. So it wouldn't surprise me. Well, we'll certainly hear more about it. At this point, I think there's maybe some other priorities for the New Democrats getting out there and introducing themselves to people. And what I was about to say too, that Calgary it's likely going to be the battleground in the next election. That's really where the election was decided in 2023, I guess it was. And I think there's every reason to expect that's where we'll see that battle again. And Nenshi, as you said, he's had stampedes before as mayor of Calgary. He's been around in Calgary for a long time, but he's a new face on the provincial scene, and he needs to reintroduce himself to Calgary voters. He was not the world's most popular mayor when he left the mayor's office, and Calgarians, I think, feel like they know him and know his record. And for some Calgarians, that's a very, very good thing. For other Calgarians, that's a very, very bad thing. And so he's, I think, got some work to do in Calgary. Edmonton, of course, tends to be an NDP stronghold, but we also don't have, 11 years or whatever it was of him as our mayor. So there's going to be some work to be done in Edmonton and Calgary. And, I think the rural areas are maybe largely a write-off for the New Democrats, and that is what it is. But it's important for him in particular, I think, to be at all of these events, as many as he can possibly, squeeze in to let people know who he is, reassure people that he isn't the person that the UCP says he is, because, of course, they've also launched a major attack ad campaign against him.
So Tyler, any more talk here in Lethbridge about a potential by-election? Has Premier Smith maybe said anything since Shannon Phillips stepped down as the representative for NDP Lethbridge West?
Yeah, not that I've seen actually, but it's got to be coming up soon. I think there's 6 or 8 weeks or something like that to make the announcement of when that by-election will happen. And then I would expect it to be held maybe towards the fall, when people are sort of back in the office, so to speak. Nobody shows up to a summer by-election, certainly, let alone a summer general election campaign. No one shows up to those either. So I would expect to hear more about that ahead, and that's going to be a really important one to watch. I think we've talked about this before. That it's going to be a chance for the NDP to show they can hold on to a seat that's going to be pretty heavily contested. It's a big loss of a prominent member of the NDP caucus, and they're going to want to keep that seat. And Nenshi's going to want to show that he can be competitive in ridings outside of Edmonton and parts of Calgary. So it's going to be, there's a lot of talk sometimes about by-elections being a bellwether or taking the temperature of the parties, showing us how the winds are blowing in politics. Sometimes that's true. The case of the recent by-election in Toronto that the Conservatives won when the Liberals had held it for the last, 15 or 20 years maybe. And this is, I think, going to be another one. This will really show what the NDP has got under its belt when it comes to actually winning elections.
It'll be interesting to see as well if Cheryl Seaborn, the UCP candidate last provincial election for Lethbridge West, and a nurse as well, will be running against whoever the NDP choose to put in there to run as a candidate. Now, Tyler, news broke earlier this week that after 18 years, hunters in our province will get a shot at killing grizzly bears. Now, it's not a return to the grizzly bear hunt. The province changed the rules around conservations that will allow hunters, instead of wildlife officers, kill problem bears to really protect Albertans and livestock.
Yeah, it was a bit of a confusing thing when it all came out. So this was all changed very, very quietly a few weeks ago. There was some updates made by regulation to the Wildlife Act, and it was noticed by a sharp-eyed reporter at a newspaper in Canmore and Banff, and they wrote a story about it, and that's what sort of tipped everyone off to it, I think. So the grizzly bear hunt did end in 2006. Prior to that, there was an annual grizzly bear hunt. You could apply to have a tag to go get a grizzly bear. The last year in 2005, I think 10 bears were killed and 73 permits were issued. So that was the last one. 2006, it came to an end. They put a 3-year moratorium on it that just hasn't ended. And back in 2002, the province had the provincial legislative environment committee basically said that, look, the species is threatened in terms of their population. We need to put a stop to the bear hunt. And it took a few years for that to happen. But so what's happened now is it's not a return of that actual hunt, although certainly people are trying to make it seem that way. But what it is, there are problem wildlife across, various types of animal, whether that's wolves or coyotes or bears. And sometimes those animals get euthanized. If a grizzly bear attacks and kills somebody, that bear tends to be tracked down and euthanized. And so what this change will do is Todd Loewen, the Forestry, Parks and Tourism Minister, will create sort of a pool of eligible hunters. And if there is a problem grizzly bear, they will put a call out to people in that pool. Someone will get permission to get up to that site in 24 hours, and then they can do the killing of the bear, and they'll get to keep the carcass or the head or whatever else a hunter might want to keep from a grizzly. So it's really just in some ways farming out the duties of a wildlife officer, one duty of the wildlife officer, which is to pull the trigger, to a potential hunter. It's going to be controversial. It already is controversial. The NDP has already come out saying that this is not going to stop human wildlife conflicts. This is not going to stop livestock bear conflicts. And the NDP's Sarah Meligi, I believe her name is she's actually a bear biologist. She's the Banff Kananaskis MLA, so a little bit of expertise on the NDP side when they come out firing against this. So it's going to be a little controversial. The UCP did have to put out a statement on Tuesday about it because reporters started asking questions, and they really tried to paint this as this is about protecting property and humans and livestock, so that's certainly the argument they're making. It's the conservation folks in the NDP are, they're not buying that argument. Let's say that.
Tyler, politicians are obviously on their summer legislative break right now. And an item that didn't receive a lot of attention was how the government struck an advisory committee to evaluate how Alberta recognizes foreign credentials. I mean, we've all heard the stories about a foreign-trained doctor comes to Alberta, comes to Canada to drive a cab because he or she cannot practice here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this is one of those things you hear about a lot in the medical field, and sometimes those doctors or nurses or whatever end up in sort of lesser roles and things like that. But it's of course true for a variety of different professions as well. So, and with the increasing immigration or migration to Alberta, with the economy booming and people looking for jobs and people looking for workers, it does make some sense to sort of try and streamline this process a little bit and figure out how you can get some of these trained people into roles quicker. I mean, obviously there are circumstances where a doctor is a great example, where you want to make sure that someone trained abroad has the same qualifications and skill set that a Canadian trained doctor would have. But certainly there's concern that you have sort of crucial parts of the economy, crucial workers in the economy who are unable to participate in a role that is necessary. And so this committee will sort of look in that. I think they have a couple years. They're struck for a couple years, and I would expect them to make sort of recommendations over the next couple years about how to address that gap a little bit. So it feels really overdue, actually. It feels like one of those things that has been talked about for a really long time, and I don't know if anyone's ever really got around to doing anything. And the other thing I should mention, which is on exactly the same issue pretty much, is that Ontario and Alberta have struck a memorandum of understanding about trying to recognize some of these qualifications, across provinces, because so much of this is regulated by the provinces, right? It's not necessarily the federal government that's saying, well, you can be a doctor or an engineer or whatever. So provinces, there's a little bit of red tape when you move provinces in some of these professions. So this is another example of some interprovincial cooperation that ought to have some good economic outcomes.
Yeah, the MOU is definitely going to help, like you said, professionals between Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Now, Tyler, on Bridge City News, we often talk about polls. Polls are pretty big here. And a new poll came out recently that talked about Nenshi and the numbers for the NDP since he took over as leader. What do the results tell us right now?
Well, what they tell us is that Nenshi and the new NDP have not made up a considerable amount of ground in the last couple weeks. Now, it's obviously early days, but they still have about a 14-point lead behind the UCP. I think the UCP would get about 54% of the vote, and the NDP would get about 40% of the vote. Those are about the same numbers as it was several months ago. I think the last time this polling firm did polling on this was in March. So there basically just hasn't been a big change in the overall sort of vote proportions that would go to each party. There's a bunch of possible explanations for that. People might be relatively happy with what Danielle Smith's UCP are doing, and people aren't really shifting their votes. People might not be really paying attention all that much. Nenshi is an unknown quantity to some extent in parts of the provinces. There's a few explanations for it. What has happened, and these are both not contradictory, but very strange in the Alberta context, is that the NDP's or the UCP's lead in Calgary has fallen from about 8 points to 4 points or 2 points. It's contracted at any rate. So Nenshi's ascension to the helm of the NDP has actually helped the NDP in Calgary, which is a good thing. And maybe makes sense, but of course good for him, maybe makes sense because they know him. The confusing thing is that the NDP lead in Edmonton has actually contracted considerably from, I think, 11 points down to 2 or 4 points. Wow. And Edmonton is the NDP stronghold. The NDP holds every single seat in this city. Even when Jason Kenney was premier, I believe there was only one UCP MLA in Edmonton. Very strange development, and it's hard to say what's happening there. Did people really like Rachel Notley and they don't like Nenshi as much? Are they happy with something that Danielle Smith and her crowd have been doing? It's really hard to say. But if you're sitting in the NDP, war room or planning room, you must be very happy about the Calgary numbers. But what is going on in Edmonton? That's really, really strange. And hopefully there will be some more polling in the weeks and months ahead that'll shed a little bit of light on what exactly is going on there.
Hey, Tyler, it's all about balance. There you go. A carbon capture and storage hub 45 kilometers from Edmonton has passed another hurdle in getting built as the companies Shell and ATCO ink to deal with the province. Tyler, explain why this is so important.
Well, it's important because it's moving through the process of going from, a concept, an idea, to actually getting some of the federal approvals to get built. There's been, of course, a lot of talk over the last few years, the last decade, probably the last 2 decades, about carbon capture and storage. And what we are sort of seeing now is projects that are moving through the various processes, whether that's finding sites, getting provincial approvals, securing funding. And then, of course, there are these federal hurdles that need to be covered. Of course, we've talked about Bill C-69 before, which overhauled the Impact Assessment Act, which approves sort of large infrastructure projects. So there are still lots of steps to be done in this process. But what it really shows is that there's some degree of corporate interest in getting these things done. There's some degree of corporate viability in the sense that they're willing to put up money and time and effort to make these things happen. And there is, of course, broad agreement between Alberta's politicians and folks in the oil and gas sector, and to some extent the federal government, that these are projects that need to get done. Who knows how far away we are from getting some of these things done. There are some big disputes about funding between the province and the federal government on some of the other projects that are being considered. But this sort of just does go to show that these are viable projects in the sense that they are moving through this process, whatever timeline that might take. And it's probably a good sign for, another sector of Alberta's economy.
Legal Aid and the Alberta government have extended their funding agreement until September. Now, this is good news for Albertans who cannot afford access to legal representation. Also good news that both parties are back at the negotiating table.
Yeah, so this was sort of an early summer drama last week or late the week before, where there was a funding agreement basically between the provincial government and Legal Aid Alberta. And that funding agreement had expired in late June. And so they were sort of talking about how they were going to move forward with funding. And there was some disagreement. They're sort of very much talking past each other in what they've said publicly about what's happened, which is a little bit confusing. But Legal Aid Alberta basically said that the government was trying to remove some of its independence in its new agreement. And the province did say, well, we're not going to interfere with the independence. We're feuding over the funding a little bit. So, but the point is, the Legal Aid Alberta was saying, look, we're close to closing doors for the summer because we won't be able to continue operating. And so they've basically agreed to continue with the funding scheme they have until September 5th. So that'll be sort of the next deadline in that debate, that discussion, that negotiation about what's going to happen there. Legal aid, obviously, not something that anybody ever really wants to have to access, and not something that, frankly, a lot of people qualify for. It does have fairly strict income requirements and things like that, but an absolutely crucial service to some of the less well-off Albertans who find themselves in a situation where they need legal representation. So a bit of a big early summer conflict that seems to have been put on the back burner, at least for another, 6 weeks or so.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post. Tyler Dawson, thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.